Hi guys, tonight we begin a calm journey into one of the most fascinating and unsettling chapters of ancient Rome, the life of Emperor Caligula. His reign was short, but the echoes of his madness have lasted for centuries. He was adored, feared, and ultimately destroyed by the very empire he ruled. In this quiet story, we'll drift through his life, from the promise of youth to the shadows of power and paranoia. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe, and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. Caligula was born in 12 CE in the coastal town of Antium, into the powerful Julio-Claudian dynasty. His real name was Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, but from childhood, people called him Caligula, meaning little boots. The nickname came from the miniature soldier's outfit he wore while accompanying his father, the popular General Germanicus, on military campaigns. The Roman soldiers loved him, a tiny mascot running among the legions. No one could have imagined that this cheerful child would one day be remembered as one of Rome's most infamous rulers. Germanicus, his father, was everything Rome admired: brave, noble, and adored by the people. But when Caligula was only 7, his father died mysteriously in Syria. Some whispered that Emperor Tiberius had poisoned him, jealous of Germanicus's popularity. The death of his father cast a long shadow over Caligula's childhood. His mother, Agrippina the Elder, publicly accused Tiberius of murder, a dangerous move in a world where emperors held life and death in their hands. The emperor's response was swift and cruel. Agrippina and 2 of her sons were exiled, and they eventually died in isolation. Only Caligula survived, along with his sisters. The boy who had once been a beloved mascot became an orphan of suspicion, growing up surrounded by whispers of betrayal and loss. When he was called to live with Tiberius on the island of Capri, many feared for his life. Tiberius was by then an aging ruler, withdrawn from public life and surrounded by secrecy and fear. Capri was said to be a place of dark pleasures and silent executions, a palace of paranoia. Yet Caligula somehow learned to survive. He watched, he listened, and above all he pretended. The young man smiled at his great-uncle, obeyed him, and learned the art of concealment. Never show your heart, he must have told himself, for Rome will tear it apart. In these quiet years, the seeds of his future were being planted, seeds of mistrust, performance, and revenge. When Tiberius finally died in 37 CE, the empire exhaled. The people rejoiced, believing that the golden son of Germanicus would restore Rome's dignity. Caligula, only 24, was welcomed as a saviour. The Senate called him the beloved of the gods. Crowds lined the streets. Sacrifices were made in his honour. Gold rained down from balconies. It was said that even hardened soldiers wept with joy at his coronation. For the first months, it seemed the empire's faith had been rewarded. Caligula reduced taxes, released political prisoners, and brought back the ashes of his mother and brothers for a public funeral. The people adored him. He was generous, charming, and kind. A prince reborn into the light after years in the shadows. But behind the bright smile, something fragile was stirring. A mind cracked by years of fear and hidden anger. In time, that fracture would widen into madness. And Rome, still cheering, had no idea what was coming. The first months of Caligula's reign felt like a festival that never ended. Rome glowed with optimism. Crowds filled the streets whenever he appeared, shouting his name with affection rather than fear. Statues of his father, Germanicus, were raised once again, and people praised the young emperor for restoring the honour of his family. Caligula seemed to embody everything the Romans longed for after years of Tiberius's cold rule: youth, vitality, and compassion. He gave bonuses to soldiers, hosted grand games, and spent days listening to petitions from ordinary citizens. The empire felt alive again. Yet beneath the marble smiles and cheering crowds, something dark was forming inside him. In the autumn of that same year, Caligula fell terribly ill. Ancient writers said his fever burned so high that the palace fell into panic. Senators prayed, temples filled with offerings, and families across Rome kept vigil through the night. When, at last, the emperor recovered, the city erupted in celebration, but many who had seen him during those days claimed that the man who awoke was not the same as the one who had fallen sick. It was as though something in his mind had shifted. The gentle tone vanished. His laughter became sharp and unpredictable. His decisions grew erratic. He began to look at the world, and at those closest to him, with a strange testing gaze, as if measuring how far he could push before they would resist. Some historians believe the illness left him brain damaged. Others think it simply unlocked what had long been hidden. Years of resentment and pain suddenly freed. Whatever the truth, Rome soon realized that their beloved saviour had begun to change. Caligula's generosity transformed into extravagance. He spent vast sums on games that lasted for days, ordering rare beasts to be brought from Africa and ships to be built just to stage floating banquets on the sea. The treasury, once stable, began to empty at an alarming rate. Senators whispered that the young emperor was squandering the empire's wealth on childish fantasies. Caligula responded with a smile, and more spending. He announced new festivals, gave himself grander titles, and demanded temples built in his honour. He even began referring to himself not as a man, but as a living god. At first, people laughed nervously, thinking it was a joke, but the more he repeated it, the less it sounded like one. The boy once loved by the legions now stood at the centre of the world, convinced he was divine. And Rome, dazzled by his brilliance and blinded by its own devotion, began to tremble without realizing why. Caligula's recovery marked the beginning of something no one could quite understand, a slow unravelling of the man Rome had once adored. The emperor who had been hailed as merciful began to act as though mercy itself were a weakness. Those who had prayed for his health now found themselves walking on thin air, never certain which version of Caligula would face them. The radiant young ruler who spoke of honour and justice, or the unpredictable god who seemed to test the limits of fear. At first, his strangeness appeared as eccentricity. He began dressing in glittering costumes, wearing golden sandals and precious stones in his hair. He demanded that statues of the gods be remodelled with his own face. When the high priest protested, he simply laughed, calling them blind to divinity. "The gods walk among you," he said softly, "and yet you do not bow." The Senate applauded out of fear, not faith. The people whispered that perhaps the illness had taken his soul. Then came his obsession with games, magnificent, endless spectacles that consumed the empire's resources. Gladiators fought under rainbows of coloured sand, wild animals from distant lands were released into the arenas, and musicians played day and night while Caligula sat on a golden throne, applauding like a child. He even built a floating palace on the sea at Baiae, lined with marble and gold, where feasts would drift for days across the water. He loved to stand at the edge of the deck, staring at the horizon as if he could command the waves themselves. But the laughter that once charmed Rome began to carry something colder. Behind every extravagant gesture lay a quiet challenge, to the Senate, to the gods, to fate itself. One day he summoned the senators and asked them to declare him a living deity. None dared refuse. The decree was passed, temples were ordered, and sacrifices made in his name. From that moment Caligula no longer spoke as emperor, he spoke as eternity. He referred to Jupiter as his brother and told the priests of Isis that she whispered to him in dreams. His nights became restless. Servants reported him wandering the palace halls, muttering to invisible companions. At dawn he would appear before his court refreshed, smiling, and more brilliant than ever. "Rome," he said once, "must learn to worship what it fears." His divine status soon became a tool for control. Those who flattered him were rewarded beyond measure. Those who hesitated vanished quietly. Senators disappeared, their estates seized for the treasury. Even his family was not spared. His cousin Gemellus, once heir alongside him, was accused of plotting treason. Caligula looked into the boy's eyes and said, "Do not fear, cousin. The gods have no rivals." Moments later, Gemellus was gone. The city that had once rejoiced at Caligula's rise now trembled at the sound of his footsteps. Still, no one dared speak openly, for in Rome, silence was often safer than truth, and in that silence, madness began to bloom like a dark flower across the empire. As months passed, Caligula's sense of power swelled beyond human boundaries. He began to see himself not merely as Rome's ruler, but as the very embodiment of fate. He once said that the world had been mistaken to give him birth as a man, for he was something greater, a spirit meant to rule over mortals and gods alike. These were not words shouted in rage, but spoken softly, almost serenely, as if he believed them with every breath. In his mind, the empire itself existed for his amusement. One of his most notorious acts was the construction of a temporary bridge across the Bay of Baiae, made from hundreds of ships lashed together. It stretched nearly 3 miles across the water, an impossible structure that defied logic. The reason? A prophecy had claimed Caligula had no more chance of becoming emperor than of riding a horse across the bay. So he decided to do exactly that. Wearing armour made of gold and a crown of jewels, he galloped across the sea declaring victory over fate itself. The crowds cheered, uncertain whether to laugh or tremble. Some said the display was magnificent. Others whispered it was madness disguised as triumph. But for Caligula, it was proof that even destiny could be conquered by his will. His appetite for grandeur grew insatiable. He drained the treasury to build new palaces, fountains, and theatres. He demanded exotic animals and treasures from every province, not because he needed them, but because he could. He renamed months after himself and his family, and when one senator suggested that such honours were excessive, Caligula smiled and invited him to dinner. The man was never seen again. To sustain his spending, he imposed cruel new taxes. Merchants were forced to pay for the privilege of doing business. Weddings were taxed, lawsuits were taxed, even the wages of soldiers were reduced. When the Senate begged him to reconsider, Caligula reminded them that gods owed explanations to no one. He would often attend trials in disguise, sitting among the audience and laughing when the accused pleaded for mercy. Once, when a man was sentenced to death, Caligula ordered the execution to be delayed simply so he could enjoy his lunch without interruption. "Let him wait," he said. "I have an appetite for anticipation." The court laughed nervously. The condemned man did not. His cruelty was not always loud. Sometimes it was terrifyingly calm. He would call a senator late at night just to ask absurd questions about loyalty or philosophy, then dismiss him with a smile. No one knew if such visits meant favour or doom. Fear had become his most loyal servant. Rome's once proud Senate was reduced to an audience of actors, bowing on command. Caligula began referring to himself as Neos Helios, the new sun. He ordered temples to open at dawn only when he appeared, declaring that daylight itself waited for his permission. Each morning the city rose with uncertainty. Would the sun rise for them, or not at all? Yet even in this chaos there were moments when the young emperor seemed strangely human again. He could be gentle with animals, affectionate with children, and capable of sudden acts of generosity. It was as though fragments of the boy who had once run among the soldiers still flickered beneath the godlike mask. But those moments were fleeting. Power had consumed him completely, and Rome, helpless and awed, watched as their emperor drifted further into his own divine storm. The further Caligula drifted into his divine delusion, the more his world became a theatre where he was the only true actor. The empire's grand halls turned into stages for his moods, and every senator, soldier, and servant became part of his performance. He enjoyed blurring the line between life and spectacle, between worship and humiliation. One evening, during a lavish banquet, he ordered guests to drink wine mixed with pearls dissolved in vinegar, a show of his limitless wealth. When one senator remarked in awe, Caligula smiled and said, "If Rome could drink gold, I would fill her cup." Another time he invited high-ranking officials to dine, only to seat their wives beside him and whisper softly to each throughout the meal. Later, he would describe in detail what he claimed had happened afterward, leaving the men pale with rage and fear. Caligula's cruelty was theatrical, but behind the laughter lay a deep and growing isolation. He no longer trusted anyone, not the Senate, not the Praetorian Guard, not even his own family. He would switch from warmth to suspicion in a heartbeat. A kind word could become a death sentence the next morning. Some believed he delighted in uncertainty because it made him feel alive, as though fear were the only honest reaction people had left. He began to see Rome itself as a reflection of his moods. Beautiful when he was pleased, doomed when he was not. He also became obsessed with omens and the supernatural. Every thunderstorm, every strange dream, he saw as a message from the gods confirming his divinity. He ordered priests to rewrite prophecies that did not favour him and punish those who hesitated. The will of the gods, he said, is what I decide it to be. He even spoke to the full moon, standing on his palace balcony for hours as if holding a conversation. Servants claimed to hear him laugh at nothing, answering unseen voices with a calm, childlike tone. Some nights, he would command the palace musicians to play soft music until dawn, while he wandered barefoot through the marble halls talking to shadows. His relationship with the Roman people also began to twist. Where once he had been adored, now he tested their loyalty through fear. He would appear suddenly in public places, ordering silence, and question the crowd about their devotion. "Do you love your God?" he would ask. The people trembling shouted, "Yes," but he often punished them anyway, claiming their voices were not loud enough. He delighted in watching love turn to terror, perhaps because it mirrored the transformation inside himself. Despite everything, there were flashes of brilliance in his rule. Caligula initiated several ambitious construction projects, aqueducts, temples, and even the beginning of a massive amphitheatre, but he abandoned most before completion. His attention moved too quickly, driven by impulse rather than purpose. The empire's engineers often joked in whispers that they built more ruins than monuments under his reign, and yet there was still something mesmerizing about him. Even his worst enemies admitted that when Caligula spoke, his words carried an almost hypnotic beauty. He could charm a crowd and terrify a senate in the same breath. To some, he was still the golden boy of Germanicus, shining too brightly to be understood. To others, he had become the storm itself, beautiful, terrible, and unstoppable. The man who had once promised to restore Rome's glory was now pulling it into darkness, one performance at a time. By the third year of Caligula's reign, the golden promise of his early days had vanished entirely. The empire that once celebrated his every gesture now lived in quiet dread. The Senate no longer debated, it performed. Every law, every speech, every applause was an act of survival. To praise the emperor was to live another day, to hesitate was to disappear. Caligula had mastered the art of ruling through uncertainty. No one could predict what pleased him, and that unpredictability became his greatest weapon. He often said, "Power is not having to explain yourself," and he meant it. His court became a labyrinth of fear and fascination. He surrounded himself with flatterers, jesters, and sycophants, people who could amuse him or tell him what he wanted to hear. Those who tried to reason with him were met with a blank smile or a dangerous silence. He began to speak openly of his divine lineage, claiming direct descent from Jupiter and the goddess Venus. He ordered the heads of ancient statues replaced with his own likeness, and when the sculptors hesitated, he reminded them that hesitation was treason. Even his horse, Incitatus, became part of his growing mythology. Caligula adored the animal, feeding it oats mixed with gold flakes and housing it in a marble stable draped with purple silk. When senators mocked him behind closed doors, saying that Rome had gone mad, Caligula laughed first, because he had already turned their whispers into reality. He declared that Incitatus would soon be made a consul, a symbol, he said, of purity and loyalty, traits he found lacking in men. Some took it as a joke, others as an insult, but most understood the message. If a horse could rule Rome, What need was there for senators at all? Caligula's mind seemed to dance constantly between brilliance and cruelty. One day he might free prisoners or cancel debts. The next he would order executions for no reason at all. He treated life as theatre, and death as its most powerful scene. When a man's fortune displeased him, he would invite him to a feast and joke, "Eat well, for you dine with the dead." Those who laughed survived. Those who did not were never seen again. His public appearances became unpredictable performances. Sometimes he would arrive dressed as Mars, the god of war, or as Neptune, carrying a trident and demanding that soldiers salute him as Lord of the Seas. Once, during a mock military campaign in Gaul, he ordered his legions to line up along the shore and collect seashells as trophies of their conquest. "The spoils of the ocean," he called them. The soldiers obeyed, silent and confused. To question him was dangerous, to laugh was fatal. Caligula, watching the obedient rows of armoured men bend down to gather shells, felt triumphant. "Now," he said, "Rome will know that even the sea kneels before me." It was madness, yes, but also something more complex, a demonstration that power could reshape reality itself. He was teaching Rome that truth meant nothing compared to the will of its emperor, and the city learned quickly. Poets wrote verses comparing him to Apollo. Artists painted him bathed in divine light. His image was placed beside the gods in temples. Even the priests learned to pray in his name. But beneath the gold and marble, resentment grew. The senators who had once cheered him now met in private, whispering about the state of the empire. The soldiers who once adored him began to fear his whims, and within the Praetorian Guard, his own protectors, quiet conversations had begun. The question was no longer whether Caligula was mad, but how long Rome could survive his divinity. The empire was beginning to ache under the weight of Caligula's excess. Every day, new taxes were invented to feed his appetite for grandeur. He demanded that the wealthier citizens loan him their fortunes, knowing they would never see them again. Noble families were accused of imaginary crimes so their estates could be seized. The once prosperous treasury, filled with gold during his first months of rule, was now nearly empty. Yet Caligula continued to spend as if the gods themselves funded his desires. He built new temples in his honour, filled them with statues of himself, and ordered the construction of a massive palace complex that connected directly to the Temple of Jupiter, a physical bridge between man and God. His sense of reality had drifted far beyond that of ordinary men. At banquets, he would sometimes speak to invisible guests, pausing as if listening to replies from spirits only he could hear. At other times, he demanded silence for hours, claiming he was communicating with the moon. His closest attendants grew used to these moods, careful never to show surprise or discomfort. Even the faintest flicker of doubt could be fatal. Those who managed to amuse or comfort him, however, were showered with gifts. He could be generous in strange ways, giving entire villas to dancers or handing out gold coins to random strangers in the street, only to take them back moments later for his own amusement. Caligula's most dangerous pleasure, however, was testing loyalty. He would summon senators and ask absurd questions about philosophy, virtue, or the nature of power. Their answers didn't matter. What mattered was how quickly they agreed with him. Once, when a senator dared to correct a small historical detail, Caligula thanked him warmly, then had him executed that night for insolence. The message was clear. In Rome, truth had become whatever pleased the emperor. He also developed a morbid fascination with death. Public executions became entertainment. He would watch from his balcony as prisoners were killed, sometimes offering commentary as if at a theatre. "A fine strike," he once said after a gladiator's fatal blow, "but next time, do it with more grace." He saw no difference between art and cruelty. To him, both revealed the nature of control. When one day he grew bored of the spectacle, he ordered an entire section of the audience thrown into the arena simply to fill the silence. "Let the gods choose their favourites," he said, and turned away before the screams began. Despite all this, there were still those who adored him, people who saw in him a reflection of Rome's glory, unrestrained and invincible. Some even claimed that his madness was a kind of divine vision, that he saw truths others could not bear. But those voices grew quieter with each passing month. The Senate feared him, the army began to doubt him, and even the gods he worshipped seemed silent. Caligula, however, saw their silence as proof of his own supremacy. "If the gods disapprove," he told a priest one night, "let them strike me down, yet here I stand." The priest bowed in silence. Outside, thunder rolled across the dark Roman sky, and the emperor laughed softly, as if he had just won another argument with heaven itself. By now, Rome had become a mirror of Caligula's moods, glittering with gold one moment, trembling in silence the next. The city no longer slept peacefully. Senators woke from dreams expecting a messenger at their door, soldiers whispered superstitions before their shifts, and common citizens avoided speaking his name aloud after dark. Fear had become part of daily life, woven into the rhythm of the empire, yet Caligula seemed unaware, or perhaps completely enthralled by the uneasy inspired. To him, fear was proof of obedience, and obedience proof of his divinity. He began to demand worship openly, not in the poetic sense of admiration, but literal reverence. He ordered priests to sacrifice to him as to the gods, and placed his own statue in temples across the empire. The most scandalous decree came when he commanded that his image be placed in the Temple of Jerusalem, a holy site where the idea of worshipping a man was unthinkable. The decision nearly caused rebellion. Only the cautious diplomacy of his governor in Judea prevented catastrophe. Still, Caligula was insulted that any people could refuse to honour him. "They worship an unseen god," he said with disdain, "but I at least can be seen." He began calling himself Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. Courtiers were forced to kneel when addressing him, and even his guards had to avert their eyes in his presence. He loved the silence that followed his entrances, the way a single motion of his hand could make an entire room hold its breath. "Now," he said once, smiling faintly, "this is how Jupiter must have felt." In private, though, the emperor's restlessness grew. He slept little, ate irregularly, and spoke in bursts of intensity. His attendants described him pacing for hours through the palace halls, muttering to himself, then suddenly stopping to laugh at nothing. He ordered marble mirrors to be installed everywhere so that his reflection would follow him, a constant reminder, he said, that the divine never rests. His paranoia deepened. He no longer trusted his guards and would often switch sleeping chambers in the middle of the night, convinced that assassins lurked nearby. He tested his food with poisons and demanded that servants taste every dish before he did. Even his sisters, once adored, began to fear him. One by one they fell out of favour, exiled, accused, or worse. The people of Rome whispered that the gods had cursed him with the same madness that once haunted his great-uncle Tiberius. But there was a strange logic to his cruelty. Caligula seemed to see life as a stage where everyone had a part and only he could decide when the performance ended. When a noble complained of poverty, Caligula invited him to dinner, and then mocked him for eating too eagerly. When an actor performed poorly, he was executed mid-scene so that the applause could be genuine. To Caligula, power was not only control but creation. He was shaping a new world, one where even fear was an art form. Yet behind the shimmering arrogance, something hollow was forming. He had everything: wealth, adoration, absolute command, yet it brought him no peace. The laughter that once filled his halls grew rarer, replaced by long silences and sudden fits of rage. He stood often on the palace balcony at dawn, watching the lights spill over Rome's rooftops. "All of this," he whispered once, "and still I am alone." No one dared answer, and in that silence the city seemed to hold its breath with him. The empire's pulse now followed one man's mind. Caligula's every whim could shift the fate of thousands, and each sunrise brought new uncertainty. One day he might command that prisoners be freed. The next, he would order entire groups executed for imagined conspiracies. His words were law, and his moods were storms. The Senate had become a hollow echo chamber, praising whatever pleased him most that morning. Some senators competed to flatter him in creative ways. One compared him to the sun, another to the ocean, and yet another dared to say he surpassed time itself. Caligula laughed softly and said, "If I surpass time, then perhaps you shall see how I end it." That man vanished by nightfall. His relationship with the gods became increasingly theatrical. He would pray aloud, not for guidance, but for argument. "Jupiter," he once shouted during a lightning storm, "if you wish to strike me, do it now, or confess that I am your equal." When thunder cracked in response, he smiled, calling it applause. He even began to stage mock battles against the heavens, ordering soldiers to hurl spears toward the sky. "See," he told them, "the gods flee from me." His confidence was terrifying, his calmness more so. Caligula's appetite for luxury grew beyond comprehension. He built floating palaces across the Bay of Naples, decorated with gardens, fountains, and silken canopies that drifted over the water like clouds. The feasts held there were said to last for days. Endless music, golden dishes, and performers dressed as nymphs and gods. Wine flowed from jewelled fountains, and rare birds were trained to speak his name. The emperor would sit among it all, quiet, watching everyone laugh and dance, as if he were observing a dream that no longer interested him. He would sometimes stand suddenly and ask, "If I destroy all this, will you still adore me?" The room always fell silent. No one ever dared to test the answer. But as his empire glittered brighter, its foundations began to crack. The army, once loyal, grew uneasy. Soldiers grumbled about unpaid wages and senseless orders. The provinces, exhausted by taxes, sent desperate petitions begging for relief, petitions that were never read. In the provinces of Africa, a small revolt broke out, but Caligula ignored it, claiming that no one would dare rebel against a god. When told the rebels had captured a Roman fort, he laughed and said, "Then they shall learn what it means to hold the divine in their hands." No orders followed. The garrison was slaughtered days later. To Caligula, such losses were abstractions, pieces in a grand game known only to him. His isolation deepened further. He dismissed his advisors, preferring to consult omens, dice, and dreams. He spoke often of building a new capital on a mountain, closer to the stars, where mortals would need permission to visit their god. The Senate nodded as he described his plans for a golden city that would never die. But behind closed doors, whispers spread. The Praetorian Guard, his own protectors, had begun to lose faith. Their commander, Cassius Chaerea, had been mocked one too many times by Caligula's cruel jokes. The laughter that once echoed through the palace now sounded like the countdown to something inevitable. Rome was smiling still, but its smile had begun to tremble. By the 4th year of his reign, Caligula had become more unpredictable than ever. The empire moved in rhythm with his desires, and those desires shifted like the tide. He believed himself eternal, a living myth, and he acted accordingly. "Rome," he said one evening, "exists only because I allow it to." The senators bowed, pretending to agree, but the fear in their eyes betrayed them. The man they once called saviour had become something far greater and far more dangerous than an emperor. He was now a god who demanded the theatre of worship every waking moment. His palace became a world of symbols and illusions. Statues of gods lined every hall, their faces carved to resemble his own. Visitors were required to remove their shoes before entering, as if stepping into a temple. He even built a special bridge that connected his residence directly to the temple of Jupiter so that he could consult his brother whenever he wished. On certain days he would appear dressed as Mercury or Apollo, reciting verses and playing the lyre. He was graceful, radiant even, and his audience, terrified courtiers and trembling senators, clapped as if their lives depended on it. In a sense, they did. Caligula's private banquets became the stuff of legend. He would invite dozens of guests only to sit silently through the meal, studying each face. When someone dared to speak, he interrupted them with a question that no one could answer. "Do you think I can do what I wish to you?" he once asked a senator. When the man stammered, Caligula smiled. "Then why do you look so frightened? Eat, enjoy the meal, you are among friends." The senator was executed the next morning. It was not hatred that drove Caligula to such acts, but curiosity. He seemed fascinated by the thin line between loyalty and terror. Despite his cruelty, he retained a strange charisma. People could not look away. He was intelligent, witty, and capable of charm that felt almost hypnotic. When he spoke to the crowd from the balcony, his voice carried warmth and rhythm, making even his strangest proclamations sound divine. Many Romans, especially the poor, continued to adore him. He built public baths, staged games, and distributed food. "He gives us bread and laughter," they said, unaware that laughter was his sharpest weapon. Caligula knew the people's love made him untouchable, and he used it to mock the Senate further. He would appear in the forum, greeting beggars, embracing children, and handing out gold coins, then turn to the senators watching from afar and whisper, "They love me more than they ever feared you." But the empire's patience was thinning. Provinces groaned under taxes. Armies were restless, forced into meaningless pageants instead of campaigns. Even his guards began to watch him warily. Cassius Chaerea, the commander of the Praetorian Guard, endured endless humiliation. Caligula mocked his voice, his age, even his honour. Each insult cut deeper, and resentment began to smoulder. Others, too, grew weary of living in the emperor's shadow. The Senate whispered, the guards listened, and the people, though still smiling, started to lower their eyes when his name was spoken. The god of Rome had begun to lose his worshippers, and somewhere deep within the marble heart of the city, the sound of approaching betrayal was beginning to echo. The atmosphere in Rome had turned heavy, like the still air before a storm. Everyone sensed that something was nearing its breaking point, though no one dared to name it aloud. Caligula himself seemed untouched by the tension. He drifted through his days in a strange rhythm of brilliance and madness, as if the entire world were only a play written for his amusement. In the mornings he would appear before the Senate, radiant in gold, to announce new decrees that blended arrogance with absurdity. One day he proposed making his horse a priest. Another day he suggested erecting a colossal statue of himself taller than any temple in Rome. When senators laughed nervously, he smiled and said, "When a god speaks, even laughter is worship." No one laughed again. His extravagance drained the empire further. To refill the treasury, he turned creativity into cruelty. He auctioned off the lives and properties of citizens, forcing the wealthy to bid against each other for survival. He revived old laws simply to fine people for breaking them. When even that proved insufficient, he found a darker solution: executions as entertainment, where the condemned paid with their deaths for the emperor's pleasure. These spectacles became his favourite pastime. He would recline in the imperial box surrounded by musicians and food, watching as gladiators fought or prisoners pleaded. "Mercy," he would say softly, "is for those who deserve to live, and none do." Then he would raise his hand and the arena would erupt in screams. Yet not all his actions were senseless. Hidden behind the cruelty, there was a mind still capable of clarity. He issued decrees improving roads, restoring temples, and even reforming parts of the legal system. But his good deeds were poisoned by the fear that surrounded them. People no longer thanked him. They trembled. Even his moments of generosity seemed unpredictable, as if the same hand that gave gold might strike the next day. Caligula, it seemed, could not bear peace. Calmness bored him, and chaos gave him purpose. His isolation deepened. He trusted no one and dismissed most of his advisers. His remaining attendants were chosen not for wisdom but for silence. He often spoke to himself in the third person, as if narrating his own legend. "Gaius lives among mortals," he murmured one night, "but mortals live only because he dreams them." He began staging private performances in which he played both god and supplicant, blessing himself with mock humility before bursting into laughter. At night, the palace glowed with lamplight and distant music. Servants crept through corridors, fearful of being noticed. Sometimes he would summon one at random, ask about their family, then send them away with gifts, or have them executed by morning. No one understood his moods, and perhaps he didn't either. He was chasing something invisible, absolute control over both the living and the unseen. He wanted not only to rule Rome, but to command reality itself. Rumours spread that Caligula planned to move the capital east, closer to the divine lands of the sunrise. Others whispered that he had begun studying resurrection, convinced he could conquer death. Whether these tales were true no longer mattered. They reflected a ruler who had ceased to seem human. And as fear turned into despair, a quiet question began to pass from ear to ear in Rome's marble corridors. What happens when a god forgets that he was once a man? By the final months of his reign, Caligula had turned Rome into a reflection of his fractured mind, dazzling, unstable, and haunted by silence. The emperor who once promised renewal now seemed to exist only for spectacle. He believed that fear kept the empire alive, and so he fed it daily. His guards followed him through endless corridors lit by oil lamps, past marble walls carved with his own image. Servants bowed as he passed, careful not to meet his eyes, for no one could predict what might offend him. He could smile at you in the morning and have you executed before nightfall. The uncertainty itself had become a weapon sharper than any sword. The Senate had long surrendered. Their meetings became hollow rituals filled with rehearsed praise and trembling obedience. Senators debated nothing. They simply survived. Caligula sometimes attended, not to govern, but to humiliate. He would sit silently for hours, watching them squirm under his gaze, and then order one to read aloud his latest divine message. Once, when an elder stumbled over the words, Caligula burst into laughter. "You see," he said, "how mortals stumble when they try to speak the language of gods." No one dared breathe until he left the chamber. His cruelty deepened, but it was no longer loud or theatrical. It was slow, almost casual. He would confiscate homes, ruin reputations, destroy families, all without emotion. To him, Rome's citizens were figures on a stage that existed for his curiosity. "Pain," he once told a poet, "is how humans prove they are real. Without it, they are ghosts." The poet tried to praise the thought, but Caligula stopped him. "No," he said quietly, "there is no praise in truth." The next day, the poet disappeared. He continued to test the limits of his power in stranger ways. He built a temporary palace on the coast, facing the sea, where he held dialogues with Neptune, the god of the ocean. Witnesses claimed he would walk along the shore, speaking as though another presence walked beside him. Sometimes he shouted at the waves, accusing them of betrayal. Other times he threw coins and jewels into the water as offerings. "The sea," he said, "is the only thing that does not bow, yet even it will tire." Despite his madness, he still fascinated those around him. There was something magnetic in his presence, a brilliance that made it hard to look away. When he spoke, his voice was smooth and deliberate, like a storyteller describing a dream. Even his guards, though they despised him, could not forget the quiet intensity in his eyes. They said he looked at people not as living beings, but as puzzles he was meant to solve. And yet, in rare moments, a trace of the boy named Gaius would return. Late at night he would wander alone through the palace gardens, touching the leaves, whispering to the stars. Once a servant overheard him murmur, "Father, they never loved me, only the shadow of me." The words vanished into the darkness. By dawn he was again the god, the master, the madman. But even divinity cannot silence the weight of loneliness. Those who watched him closely began to see it, in his restless gestures, in his endless search for meaning. Rome was tired, the people weary. Whispers grew louder among the Praetorian Guard. The senator's fear began to turn into desperation. Everyone felt the same truth pressing closer. The emperor's play could not go on forever. Something had to break. and soon. The final act of Caligula's reign unfolded like a slow, shimmering nightmare. Every day seemed to move between brilliance and chaos, laughter and death. Rome was still standing, but its soul felt hollow. Even the sunlit marble of the Forum seemed colder now, as though the city itself had grown wary of its ruler. Yet Caligula walked through it all as if he were untouchable, a living myth drifting through the ruins of reality. He believed he had mastered the art of fear, that terror itself was proof of his immortality. "As long as they tremble," he once said, "I shall never die." He began planning a grand new project, a bridge between the Palatine and the Capitoline hills, meant to link his palace to the Temple of Jupiter permanently. He claimed it would unite heaven and earth. The structure would have required tearing down entire districts of Rome, but he did not care. "The world," he declared, "is too small for a god's footsteps." The Senate applauded weakly, aware that refusal would mean ruin. The treasury, however, could no longer bear his fantasies. The empire's wealth was drained. Soldiers went unpaid, roads crumbled, provinces starved. Yet Caligula still demanded festivals and sacrifices in his name. His paranoia reached new heights. He began seeing conspiracies everywhere, in glances, in gestures, even in silence. Those closest to him suffered the most. Trusted officers were executed for imagined plots, family members exiled or killed. He replaced his guards repeatedly, certain they whispered behind his back. His sister Drusilla, once his favourite companion, had died the year before, and her loss unmoored what little balance remained in him. He declared her a goddess, building shrines in her honour, and insisted that she spoke to him in dreams. "She is the moon," he told the priests, "and I am the sun. Together we rule the sky." The people nodded, too afraid to question whether grief or delusion guided his words. His behaviour grew stranger still. During games at the circus, he ordered the execution of an entire row of spectators simply because their boredom offended him. When the crowd screamed in terror, he smiled and said, "Now you are awake." At another event, he demanded silence for hours, then suddenly burst into laughter. When a senator dared to ask why, Caligula replied, "Because I can kill you all, and I won't. Not yet." The laughter that followed was forced and trembling. At night his restlessness deepened. He would wander the palace barefoot, carrying a lamp, his eyes glassy with exhaustion. He spoke of omens, of shadows in the walls, of the gods who envied him. "They want me back," he whispered to a servant once, "but I'm not done with this world." The servant was found dead the next day, perhaps for hearing too much, or perhaps simply to make the words real. Still, even in his madness there was method. Caligula seemed to sense that fear alone could not sustain eternity. He sought something grander, a legacy that would outlast his body. He began sketching visions of a new empire, one ruled not by Rome, but by divine order, his order. He wanted temples that touched the stars, statues that dwarfed mountains, and an afterlife where his name would echo like thunder. But every empire has limits, even one ruled by a man who believed himself immortal. And somewhere in the marble shadows of his palace, men who had once sworn loyalty began to imagine a different kind of peace, one that could only exist without him. The whispers grew bolder. They began in dark corners of the palace, passed from one trembling voice to another. No one dared to speak them aloud during the day, but at night, when the torches burned low and footsteps echoed faintly in the corridors, the same question lingered. How much longer could this continue? The Praetorian Guard, once Caligula's most devoted protectors, had started to turn cold. Years of humiliation, impossible orders, and cruel jokes had hollowed their loyalty into something brittle. Their commander, Cassius Chaerea, bore the weight of it most. Once a proud soldier, he had become the emperor's favourite target for mockery. Caligula often insulted his voice, mocked his discipline, and gave him demeaning orders during public ceremonies. To humiliate a soldier was to wound his honour, and Charia's patience had begun to die. The Senate, too, was quietly stirring. Its members had long been puppets, forced to applaud every absurd decree. Now some found courage in the shadows, murmuring that Rome's glory could not survive another year of divine madness. But no senator would act alone. They all waited, watching for someone else to move first. The city had become a place of waiting, a breath held too long. Caligula, unaware or pretending not to notice, continued his descent into self-created divinity. He announced plans for yet another temple in his honour, one made entirely of glass, so that the world may see me as I am, he said. The idea was impossible, absurd even, but no one dared to laugh. Instead, architects bowed and pretended to measure stones that did not yet exist. He declared that his horse, Incitatus, would soon become high priest of Rome's most sacred order. When asked if this was meant as a joke, he replied with icy calm, "Only the pure should speak to the gods." The court fell silent. The line between satire and decree had long disappeared. By now his paranoia was absolute. He spoke often of invisible enemies, of plots formed by shadows and spirits. He ordered his food tasters executed, convinced they had poisoned him with dreams. He changed sleeping chambers each night, never telling even his guards where he would rest. Some nights he did not sleep at all. He would stand on the balcony staring at the city lights, muttering to unseen forces. "They think I am mortal," he said once, his voice drifting down to the garden below. "But mortals cannot imagine what it means to hold the world inside your mind." Despite his delusions, the empire still functioned. Barely. Administrators and generals kept it alive through routine and silence. The provinces sent their taxes, the armies guarded the borders, the people went about their lives pretending not to see the cracks forming in the marble of their world. It was as if Rome itself had learned to survive by pretending that everything was fine. But among the Praetorians, pretending was no longer enough. Chaerea met with a few trusted men, speaking softly in a dim barracks room. "If he is a god," he said, "then let him prove it." Their faces were pale, their loyalty torn between duty and exhaustion. They agreed to nothing, not yet, but the thought had been spoken aloud for the first time, and thoughts, once born in Rome, had a way of turning into destiny. Meanwhile, Caligula prepared for yet another festival. He had decided it would celebrate himself, his victories, his beauty, his eternal rule. The city began to decorate itself under orders, banners fluttering, musicians rehearsing. To the world it looked like Rome was ready to worship again. But beneath the sound of trumpets and applause, the quiet rhythm of rebellion had already begun to beat. The winter air over Rome felt sharper that year, as if the city itself sensed something about to change. Caligula's festival of self-worship was set to begin. Days of games, parades, and sacrifices, all in his name. He had ordered every district to display banners bearing his image, every temple to burn incense to him, every citizen to attend the celebrations or face punishment. The streets shimmered with gold fabric and marble dust, but the joy was hollow. Behind the smiles and music, fear lingered like a shadow. People clapped because silence had become too dangerous. Caligula spent the days before the festival in restless anticipation. He held private rehearsals for his grand entrance, directing priests and dancers as if they were actors on his personal stage. He had chosen to appear as the god Apollo, wearing a cloak woven with gems and carrying a golden bow. "The world will remember this," he told his attendants. "Even the heavens will look down and envy me." No one answered, for even his praise now felt like a trap. Cassius Chaerea watched from a distance. Each new order, each fresh insult fed the quiet fire within him. Caligula had mocked him again during the rehearsals, calling him old woman and voice of the virgins in front of the court. Laughter filled the hall, sharp, terrified laughter, but Chaerea did not flinch. He only bowed his head. Later, in the barracks, he spoke to his men in low, careful tones. "He is not a god," he said. "He is a wound that will never heal unless we close it." The words spread like smoke. Soon, even those who had sworn eternal loyalty began to wonder what eternity was worth. On the morning of the festival, Caligula woke before dawn. The city outside buzzed with movement, musicians tuning instruments, soldiers lining the streets, torches lighting the fog. He looked out from his balcony, smiling faintly at the sight. "See how they wait for me," he murmured. "Even the sun waits for my signal." He spent hours dressing, inspecting every fold of his costume, every piece of gold and ivory. When he finally stepped into the grand hall, courtiers gasped, not out of awe but out of survival. He shone like something carved from fire. The festival began with thunderous applause. Caligula rode through the streets on a white chariot, the crowd forced to cheer as he passed. Coins bearing his face rained from the rooftops. He waved, his expression calm, detached, as though the celebration were merely confirmation of what he had always known, that he was the centre of the universe. Yet behind him, among the soldiers guarding the route, Charia walked in silence. He kept his hand near his sword but showed no emotion. The time had not yet come, but the decision had already been made. That night, as torches burned low and the laughter faded into exhaustion, Caligula returned to his palace. The festival would continue for days, but for him, the first day was always the sweetest. He dismissed his attendants and lingered alone in the grand corridor, admiring his reflection in the polished marble walls. "Immortal," he whispered, touching his own face. He could not see behind him in the shadows the movement of men who no longer believed in gods. The festival stretched into its second day, but the air around the palace had changed. Behind the laughter and music, a strange quiet pulsed, the kind that comes before a storm. Caligula remained unaware, or perhaps indifferent. He had entered a state beyond human caution, convinced that destiny itself obeyed him. Each moment of his life had become a ritual performance. Even his meals were staged like divine ceremonies. He dined surrounded by mirrors, watching himself from every angle, sometimes raising his cup toward his reflection as though toasting another god. "We are eternal," he once said softly to the glass. "Let them worship what they cannot become." Cassius Chaerea moved silently through the marble halls, his face calm, his voice low. He met with a handful of men, soldiers, courtiers, even a few senators, all united by exhaustion and fear. None spoke loudly. The plan needed no grand speeches. It lived in their eyes. Caligula's unpredictability had made them desperate. "We are not traitors," one whispered. "We are physicians curing a sickness." Chaerea only nodded. The moment would come soon, when the emperor least expected it, during the final day of the festival after the games. It would be quick, he promised, clean, almost merciful. Meanwhile, Caligula prepared another spectacle for the evening, a private banquet in a small underground theatre beneath the palace. Only a few chosen guests would attend, senators, guards, and performers. The room was lit by hundreds of oil lamps, the air thick with incense and gold dust. Caligula entered last, wearing a crown of emerald leaves and a cloak that shimmered like sunlight. The guests rose as one. "Sit," he said, smiling faintly. "The gods eat standing only when they are lonely." Laughter followed, fragile and forced. He spoke at length that night, about immortality, about how men feared death because they misunderstood it. "I will teach Rome to live forever," he said, his voice calm, hypnotic. He spoke of new temples, new laws, a new age where worship and obedience would be the same thing. His words flowed like poetry, beautiful and terrible at once. The audience listened in silence, unsure whether they were hearing prophecy or madness. When the feast ended, Caligula rose and dismissed the crowd. "Tomorrow," he announced, "we celebrate not my birth but my becoming." His tone was serene, almost tender. As the guests filed out, Chaerea lingered in the shadows, his hand brushing the hilt of his sword. He watched the emperor disappear down the corridor, followed by a few attendants. The echo of Caligula's sandals faded, replaced by the distant hum of the city preparing for another day of worship. Above them, Rome slept uneasily. The moonlight touched the Tiber like silver, and the wind moved softly through the streets. In that stillness, the fate of an empire waited, suspended between divinity and downfall, between the final breath of a god and the first whisper of rebellion. The morning of the final festival day arrived pale and quiet. A thin mist hung over the city, softening the edges of marble and stone. From the palace balcony, Caligula looked out over Rome and felt a strange calmness settle inside him. He believed he had conquered the world, not through armies or laws, but through sheer will. "They no longer live for themselves," he murmured, watching the smoke rise from temple fires. "They breathe because I dream it." His attendants stood behind him, still and silent. No one dared interrupt a god's meditation. Down below, the city was alive with ceremony. Priests carried garlands, musicians played in the squares, and citizens marched in processions that blurred the line between devotion and fear. The emperor's face was everywhere, painted on banners, carved into altars, stamped on coins tossed to the crowd. It was no longer possible to tell where Rome ended and Caligula began. Inside the palace, however, the air felt different. Cassius Chaerea had spent the early hours pacing, rehearsing each motion of what must come. His men, scattered throughout the corridors, waited with tense silence. Each carried a blade beneath ceremonial robes, each moved with the precision of someone holding his own life in his hands. The decision was set. After the midday games, when Caligula left the arena to return to the underground passage that led to his private chambers, they would strike. There would be no speeches, no warnings, only steel and silence. The games themselves were grander than ever. Caligula entered the amphitheatre in a robe of white and gold, his face shining under the sun. The crowd roared because they had to. He sat upon a throne at the centre of the royal box, watching as beasts and men fought below. Occasionally he would raise his hand, sparing one, condemning another, as if testing his power over fate. "Do you see?" he whispered to a companion. "Even life bends when I command." The companion laughed nervously, unsure if he was supposed to. At one point, Caligula stood, addressing the audience with the soft authority of a priest. "Rome lives because I will it," he said, "and when I no longer will it, Rome will fade." His words hung in the air like smoke. Then he smiled, as if forgiving the world for existing. When the final match ended, the emperor rose and began to leave. A handful of guards followed him down the shaded corridor leading toward the palace's inner chambers. The passage was lined with statues, his own likeness carved in marble and gold. The echo of his footsteps was rhythmic, almost ceremonial. Waiting ahead, hidden behind one of the statues, Chaerea watched him approach. His heart beat steady now, not with anger, but with a kind of peace. Around him, his fellow conspirators tightened their grips on their blades. As Caligula drew closer, he paused to admire his reflection in a bronze mirror along the wall. "Immortal," he whispered once again, smiling at himself. He never saw the movement in the shadows behind him, the glint of steel, the first breath of the storm he'd created. The corridor was dim, the air thick with incense from the games above. Caligula walked slowly, savouring the quiet after the roar of the arena. Around him, the walls seemed alive with his own face, marble eyes following his every move, each statue a reflection of his eternal presence. He loved this hallway. It was a shrine to himself, a reminder that even stone could be taught to worship. Behind him trailed a few attendants, exhausted but pretending devotion. The emperor's mood was serene. He had spoken of dreams, of omens, of a divine future that only he could see. To them, it sounded like prophecy. To him, it was truth. Ahead, Cassius Chaerea stood waiting in the half-light. His armour gleamed faintly beneath his robe, his hand resting near the hilt of his sword. The other conspirators were already in place, guards, freedmen, even a few senators disguised as attendants. Their hearts pounded, though none dared to breathe too loudly. Caligula was only a few steps away. Each footfall echoed like the tolling of a bell. "Hail Caesar!" Chaerea called out suddenly, his voice steady, formal. Caligula turned, surprised but amused. He had mocked Chaerea too many times to expect obedience from him now. "Ah," he said lightly, "our timid soldier speaks. Have you come to ask the gods for courage again?" The insult floated between them, sharp and familiar. The men nearby shifted their weight. Caligula smirked and stepped closer. "Or perhaps you've come to thank me for letting you serve me one more day." The moment broke. In a single motion, Chaerea drew his blade and struck. The first blow cut through the Emperor's shoulder, spinning him toward the wall. His eyes widened, not with fear but disbelief, as though reality itself had betrayed him. Another blade followed, then another. The corridor exploded into chaos. Caligula screamed, his voice echoing through the marble tunnel, half human, half divine. "You dare!" he gasped, clutching at his wound. "I am—" The next strike silenced the word forever. The others fell upon him with desperate fury. Years of humiliation and fear poured out through steel. The god of Rome was reduced to flesh and blood. When he finally collapsed, his body struck the floor with a dull, final sound. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The only noise was the crackle of the oil lamps. Then, slowly, Chaerea stepped forward and looked down at the fallen figure. The golden robe was torn, the jewels scattered across the floor like spilled sunlight. "He was only a man," someone whispered. Chaerea's jaw tightened. "No," he said quietly. "He was a warning." In the silence that followed, the conspirators realized what they had done. Not just slain an emperor, but shattered the illusion that had ruled them. Outside, the city still roared with celebration, unaware that its god lay dead beneath the marble. For the first time in years, the air inside the palace felt still, heavy, but free. Yet even in death, Caligula's presence lingered. The statues along the walls seemed to stare down at the killers, expressionless, eternal. Somewhere far above, the drums of the festival continued to beat, as if Rome itself refused to understand what had just changed forever. For a long moment after the final strike, no one moved. The air inside the corridor was still, filled only with the faint hiss of the oil lamps and the slow dripping of blood onto the marble floor. Caligula's body lay twisted at the base of one of his own statues, his face pale, eyes open, fixed on nothing. The men who had killed him stared in disbelief, as though they had expected lightning to strike them down. For years they had lived in the shadow of his godlike madness, and now, seeing him lifeless, they realized that the god had always been mortal after all. Cassius Chaerea was the first to speak. "It's done," he said, his voice low but steady. "Rome is free." His words felt heavy in the dim light, not triumphant but uncertain. Around him, the others began to breathe again. Some crossed themselves, others stared at their blades as if unsure how they had come to hold them. One soldier, trembling, whispered a prayer for forgiveness. Another laughed nervously, the sound echoing down the hall before dying quickly in the silence. But the silence did not last. A scream broke from one of the attendants who had witnessed the scene, a woman's cry, sharp and terrified. She ran toward the exit before anyone could stop her. Chaerea cursed under his breath. "She'll raise the alarm," he said, but it was too late. The palace guards, hearing the commotion, began shouting orders, their footsteps thundering through the corridors. The conspirators scattered into the shadows, blades still wet, hearts racing. Outside, the festival was still raging. Music echoed from the distant streets, unaware that the centre of the empire had just fallen apart. In the confusion, Caligula's wife, Caesonia, and their young daughter were found in their chambers. Soldiers loyal to Chaerea hesitated, uncertain what to do. Some argued they should be spared. Others insisted that any blood of the tyrant would bring vengeance. In the end, fear decided for them. Caesonia was struck down before she could even speak, and the child, too young to understand, met the same fate. The gods of Rome, it seemed, demanded silence. In the hours that followed, word spread through the palace like fire. Servants fled, guards argued, and senators hurriedly locked their doors. Some rejoiced quietly, others wept, fearing chaos. For a moment it was unclear who ruled the empire, if anyone did. Chaerea tried to calm the panic, calling for order. "We did this for Rome," he told his men. "There will be peace again." But even as he said it, he knew the truth. Rome did not understand peace. It understood power. Outside the palace, the sun was setting over the Tiber, painting the sky with the colour of ash and blood. The festival drums still beat in the distance, unaware that the god they celebrated was gone. In the streets, whispers began to spread, wild, confused stories of betrayal and miracles. Some said Caligula had been struck down by divine fire, others that he had ascended into the heavens. Few believed he was truly dead. Inside, Chaerea wiped his blade clean and looked once more at the fallen emperor. "You'll be worshipped now," he muttered bitterly. "Even in death they won't let you go." Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the darkness. Behind him, Caligula's lifeless eyes still caught the glow of the lamps, reflecting the faint light like the last mocking spark of a god who refused to disappear. Chaos swept through the palace like a tide breaking loose. Within minutes of the murder, shouts echoed through every corridor. Soldiers clashed with one another, not knowing who to obey. Some remained loyal to the memory of the emperor. Others followed Cassius Chaerea and the conspirators. The marble halls that had once held feasts and music now rang with the sound of steel and running feet. Statues of Caligula loomed above the confusion, their silent faces glimmering in the torchlight as if watching the chaos unfold with cold amusement. Chaerea tried to steady his men. "Hold the gates," he commanded. "We end this quickly or not at all." His voice carried the tone of a man who had crossed too far to turn back. The conspirators gathered in the courtyard, their robes stained with blood, their hearts pounding. Rome, they believed, would awaken free, but freedom had a strange, hollow sound. Above them the sky darkened into a bruised twilight. News of the emperor's death spread fast. The Praetorian Guard, split between loyalty and survival, hesitated. Some wept openly, others cheered, yet no one knew what would come next. A few soldiers rushed to protect Caligula's body, dragging it away to a quiet chamber, fearing that desecration might bring divine wrath. Even dead, the emperor's presence commanded awe. "He cannot be left in the open," one whispered. "The gods might see." Inside the palace, servants whispered prayers, senators locked themselves in their homes, and the musicians from the festival fled into the streets, leaving their instruments behind. The golden lights of celebration still flickered in the distance, unaware that the empire's heartbeat had just stopped. Chaerea called a meeting in one of the smaller halls. The conspirators gathered, pale and exhausted. "We must restore order," he said. "We name a new emperor, someone calm, someone sane." His suggestion fell upon silence until one man spoke a name. Claudius, Caligula's uncle, the quiet scholar long dismissed as weak. No one laughed. Weakness at that moment sounded like mercy. But before they could act, a messenger burst in, panting. "The guard is searching for you," he warned. "They want vengeance." The conspirators exchanged glances. They had killed a god, but the people had not yet accepted it. Rome was a city addicted to power, and it loved its tyrants as much as it feared them. As night fell, torches blazed along the palace walls. The Praetorians found Caligula's body and laid it upon a stretcher. Some bowed their heads, others spat. Then, in a grim procession, they carried the corpse into the gardens and buried it hurriedly beneath loose earth. There were no prayers, no songs, only the sound of shovels striking soil. The man who had called himself immortal now lay under the same ground as his victims. Still, Rome did not rest. Rumours spread faster than truth. Some claimed Caligula had risen again, that his ghost walked the halls demanding vengeance. Others said lightning struck the palace that night, splitting a statue of Jupiter in two. By dawn, the city buzzed with fear and disbelief. The people did not yet understand that their god was gone, or that the men who had freed them might soon face the same fate. In the pale morning light, Chaerea stood alone by the Tiber, his reflection trembling in the current. "We killed a monster," he whispered, "but we fed the myth." And somewhere deep within the city the first cries went up, not of joy, but of confusion. Rome had lost its emperor, but it had not yet found its peace. Dawn crept over Rome like a slow exhalation, washing the marble city in pale gold. The streets were strangely quiet. The echo of the festival had faded, replaced by whispers that slithered through the alleys. The emperor was dead. No one knew what to believe. Some claimed he had been struck by a god's lightning for his blasphemy, others that he had ascended to heaven as proof of his divinity. A few said it was only another of his games, that he would rise again to punish those who doubted. Fear, confusion and curiosity tangled in the morning air. Rome held its breath. Inside the palace, the conspirators waited in tense silence. Caligula's body had been buried in secret hours earlier, but his presence still seemed to haunt every corridor. His golden cloak remained draped across the throne, and the faint scent of incense and oil lingered in the air. Cassius Chaerea stood beside the doorway, eyes hollow from exhaustion. He had spent the night expecting applause for saving Rome. Instead, there was only dread. "They don't cheer," he murmured. "They whisper." The others said nothing. They too felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down on them like a stone. By midday, the Praetorian Guard had taken control of the palace gates. They were restless, torn between duty and vengeance. For years they had served Caligula, fearing him, hating him, yet bound to him by oath and gold. His death had not brought them relief, only confusion. They wanted a ruler, something solid to replace the void, and so they began to search. In one of the palace chambers, behind a curtain, they found Claudius, the timid, stammering uncle whom everyone had mocked as a fool. He had hidden there through the night, trembling at the noise of swords and shouts. When the soldiers discovered him, he fell to his knees expecting death. But the Praetorians hesitated. "We need an emperor," one said quietly. "The Senate will tear itself apart." Another nodded. "Better a frightened man than no man at all." And so, almost by accident, Claudius was lifted to the throne. The same guards who had served Caligula now saluted his successor, their faces unreadable. Outside, the Senate received the news with a mixture of relief and resentment. Some welcomed a calmer rule, others feared the army's growing power, but no one dared to challenge the decision. Rome had learned too well that chaos was worse than tyranny. That evening Chaerea watched the soldiers escort Claudius into the grand hall where Caligula had once stood. The contrast was striking. Where the young emperor had demanded divine reverence, the new one bowed humbly, his voice trembling as he swore to restore order. The people cheered, but softly, as if afraid that the dead might hear. Chaerea did not join the celebration. He knew the tide could turn quickly. Already, rumours painted him as a traitor, not a liberator. "You killed a god," one officer whispered. "Do you think men will forgive that?" He said nothing, but the words stayed with him. He had believed that ending Caligula's reign would heal Rome. Instead, he saw only shadows, and the uneasy truth that even when the tyrant dies, the fear he creates does not die with him. For a brief moment it seemed as though peace might return to Rome. The Senate met under the pale light of morning, speaking softly, almost reverently, as if afraid that the walls still carried Caligula's echo. Claudius, newly declared emperor, sat quietly at the centre, a man who had never sought power, now burdened with it by accident. His voice trembled as he promised stability, mercy, and the restoration of reason. "Rome has endured much," he said. "Let us learn to breathe again." The senators applauded, not with enthusiasm, but with relief. Yet beneath the surface, fear still flowed like an underground river. Outside the palace, the people whispered in confusion. Some celebrated, thinking a monster had fallen. Others mourned, convinced that a god had been slain unjustly. In the markets, merchants sold small portraits of Caligula beside charms to ward off his ghost. Mothers warned their children not to speak his name after sunset. And every night a strange hush settled over the city, a silence filled not with calm but with memory. Cassius Chaerea moved through these days like a man walking in a dream. He had expected Rome to thank him, to see him as a saviour. Instead he found suspicion. The Praetorian Guard, though respectful to his face, watched him closely. The Senate avoided his eyes, and Claudius, gentle, cautious Claudius, grew distant. He fears me, Chaerea thought. He should. He had killed a god in the eyes of many. Even the new emperor could not feel safe near him. Within a week, the mood shifted. Caligula's supporters within the guard began demanding vengeance. They claimed the conspirators had not acted for Rome, but for their own ambition. If they can kill one emperor, they muttered, they can kill another. Claudius listened to these whispers in silence, torn between gratitude and fear. He owed his crown to the same men who had murdered his nephew, yet he knew Rome could not survive another wave of blood. One afternoon, messengers arrived at Chaerea's home, summoning him to the palace. He went calmly, though he understood what it meant. The guards did not meet his eyes. As they led him through the halls, he noticed that Caligula's statues were already being removed, not destroyed, but hidden away, as if Rome itself was unsure whether to forget or to preserve its madness. In the audience chamber, Claudius sat behind the throne, his expression weary. "Cassius Chaerea," he said softly, "you served Rome, and yet you killed its emperor." His voice wavered between pity and judgment. The city trembles still. The gods are not silent. Chaerea bowed his head. "I freed Rome from a monster," he said. "You know where the peace I gave you?" Claudius sighed. "Perhaps, but peace built on blood does not last." The trial was brief. The Senate condemned Chaerea for treason, though many of its members owed him their lives. The law demanded an emperor's death be avenged. "Rome must have order," Claudius said quietly as the verdict was read. Chaerea smiled faintly. "Rome will always have order," he replied, "but never innocence." When the guards came for him, he stood tall, neither pleading nor resisting. That night, as torches flickered along the riverbanks, Chaerea's execution was carried out. Some said he died with a calm expression, others that he whispered a prayer to no god in particular. His final words were said to be, "May Rome learn mercy before it forgets madness." And somewhere in the darkness, the wind carried the faint, hollow sound of laughter. Whether from memory or from the ghost of the emperor, no one could tell. The execution of Cassius Chaerea marked the closing of one chapter and the uneasy beginning of another. Rome had rid itself of a tyrant, but it had not rid itself of fear. Even with Caligula gone, his shadow lingered, in the trembling of servants who still avoided speaking too loudly, in the way senators glanced over their shoulders before whispering. The empire had been scarred, and scars once made do not vanish easily. Claudius ruled now, cautious and deliberate like a man walking through the ruins of a storm. He tried to bring calm, but calm was a fragile thing in a city that had learned to thrive on chaos. The corpse of Caligula had been buried hastily in a shallow grave, yet even in death, his legend grew. Rumours spread that strange lights flickered above the burial site at night. Some swore they heard faint laughter echoing through the halls of the palace. Others claimed that his ghost appeared near the gardens, wrapped in a tattered cloak of gold, whispering that Rome had made a mistake. The people, ever superstitious, began to leave offerings, flowers, coins, small carvings of the emperor's likeness. He was cruel, they murmured, but he was powerful. Perhaps the gods still listened to him. Claudius ordered the body moved and burned in secret, its ashes scattered in the sea. Yet even that could not erase the myth. Across the empire, Caligula's story became something more than history. It became a warning, a legend of how power, once unbounded, devours its master. Playwrights turned his madness into whispered theatre. Poets wrote of the man who called himself a god and dared to challenge Jupiter. In the provinces, his name was spoken with both horror and fascination. Some even prayed to him, asking for the courage to defy fate as he had. In private, Claudius studied the reports left behind by his nephew. Strange decrees, half-finished letters, fragments of speeches about immortality and fate. He found them disturbing yet strangely poetic. He saw too far, Claudius said once to his advisers, farther than sanity allows. But even he, the scholar emperor, could not entirely hate the man who had been both his family and his curse. Years passed, and Rome changed, as it always did. The marble that once reflected Caligula's image began to weather. The gold faded. New emperors rose and fell, new monuments were built. Yet the story of Gaius Caligula, the little boy who ran among soldiers, the young man hailed as a saviour, the ruler who became a god in his own mind, endured. Parents told it to their children at night as a tale of pride and madness. Philosophers debated it in quiet chambers. Was Caligula evil, or merely human, stripped of all restraint? Centuries later, historians would argue still. Some would say he was a monster, others a victim of the unbearable weight of divinity. But within the heart of Rome, beneath the layers of time and dust, his name would continue to echo. For Caligula had achieved the one thing he always desired: immortality, not of the body, but of memory. The city he once ruled in terror would never truly forget him, and sometimes, on windless nights when the Tiber reflected the stars like shards of glass, people swore they could hear faint footsteps in the old palace ruins, light, deliberate, and followed by a whisper that seemed to smile through the dark. The gods walk among you still. Centuries rolled forward, but Caligula's name refused to sink into silence. Time erases kings, blurs empires, softens cruelty into rumour, yet somehow his legend survived every tide. In the centuries that followed, his story passed through the hands of poets, monks and scholars, each reshaping it in their own image. To some, he became a cautionary ghost of power unrestrained. To others, he was a dark mirror of humanity itself, proof that within every throne sits the possibility of madness. Rome fell and rose again in different forms, yet his shadow seemed to linger in each new empire that learned to worship strength and fear its own reflection. Ancient writers, seeking to make sense of him, filled scrolls with their theories. Some claimed illness had warped his mind beyond repair. Others said grief over his lost family had burned away his mercy. A few even whispered that his madness had been divine punishment, that by daring to mock the gods he had drawn their laughter upon himself. Whatever the truth, the man who once declared himself immortal achieved a strange kind of eternity. He became a story no one could stop telling. Over time, artists revived his image again and again. Sculptors carved his face in cold marble, neither condemning nor forgiving. Painters, centuries later, would drape him in light and shadow, caught forever between beauty and horror. Dramatists wrote his life as tragedy, scholars as warning, and dreamers as myth. Every age saw something of itself in him: ambition, brilliance, fragility, and the slow corrosion of the soul beneath power's weight. It was as though the empire had built him not merely as a man, but as a symbol, a reminder of what happens when fear and worship become the same thing. Archaeologists would one day uncover the remnants of his palaces, the foundations of his bridges, the faint outlines of temples built in his honour. Even in ruin, they carried his arrogance. A golden inscription discovered near the Bay of Baiae read, "The sea obeys me." Scholars debated whether it was authentic or apocryphal, but few doubted that he could have spoken it. His defiance was too vast to fade into myth completely. Modern readers, centuries distant from his reign, would look upon his life with fascination, horrified yet entranced. In a world still ruled by ambition, still tempted by the illusion of control, his story felt strangely familiar. The details of his cruelty may have belonged to the past, but the roots of it, vanity, loneliness, the hunger to be adored, were timeless. In Caligula, people saw both monster and man, and so, across the centuries, his legend remained a quiet reflection of power's oldest truth, that the line between God and tyrant is drawn not by strength, but by mercy. Rome, in its wisdom and folly, had birthed both the brightest minds and the darkest rulers. Among them, Caligula stood apart, not for the greatness he achieved, but for how vividly he revealed the fragility of greatness itself. His story would outlive empires, carried in whispers and books, in art and memory. And though the man had long since turned to dust, the echo of his reign endured, not as a celebration nor a curse, but as a question still unanswered. How close can humanity come to divinity before it begins to destroy itself? Centuries after Caligula's death, his memory still stirred unease among those who studied the old empire. Historians, poring over ancient texts, tried to separate the man from the myth, but every record seemed coloured by fear or fascination. Some chroniclers, like Suetonius and Cassius Dio, painted him as a monster beyond reason, a man who delighted in cruelty for its own sake, who confused love with domination and worship with terror. Others, writing generations later, wondered if those stories had been exaggerated, sculpted by those who needed villains to make sense of their own obedience. Perhaps they mused Caligula had been less mad than misunderstood, a ruler consumed by the theatre of power he had inherited. It is easy to condemn from the safety of distance, but those who looked closely saw something more complicated in his rise and fall. He had been adored before he was feared, celebrated before he was hated. The people who crowned him a god had also built the throne that destroyed him. In him they saw their own desires magnified, their longing for greatness, their hunger for spectacle, their willingness to trade freedom for awe. When they cheered his madness, they mistook it for genius. When they bowed to his cruelty, they told themselves it was destiny. Caligula had not invented Rome's sickness. He had only reflected it, a mirror too bright for anyone to face for long. Over the centuries, his story grew into a parable retold in palaces and classrooms alike. Philosophers used his name as a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority. Psychologists, centuries later, saw in him one of history's earlier studies of narcissism and trauma. A child who lost everything, who learned early that love was conditional and power eternal. The young boy, once nicknamed Little Boots, had been adored by soldiers and scarred by emperors. Perhaps his cruelty had begun not in malice but in survival, the only language he had ever known. Artists could not resist his image. In Renaissance paintings he appeared draped in crimson, his eyes cold but beautiful. Playwrights turned his life into operas of madness and sorrow. Even in the modern age, filmmakers and writers revived him, fascinated by the mixture of grandeur and fragility that defined him. Each generation reshaped him in its own reflection, as tyrant, victim, visionary, or fool. Yet no matter how he was remembered, one truth remained. Caligula embodied the point where ambition eclipses humanity. His reign showed that when a man begins to believe he is divine, the world around him must either kneel or burn. And still, within that darkness, there was something unmistakably human. The yearning to be seen, to matter, to leave a mark that time could not erase. Perhaps that is why, after 2,000 years, his name still carries a strange electricity. He was Rome's fever dream, its brilliance and madness distilled into one fragile body. And though the empire that birthed him is long gone, the warning he left behind endures, that power, unrestrained, does not reveal the gods in us, it exposes the ghosts. As centuries turned into millennia, Caligula's life remained one of history's most haunting paradoxes. a story endlessly retold, never fully understood. Time, which erases most men, seemed only to polish his legend sharper. In dusty libraries and marble museums, his name was still spoken with a mix of awe and unease. Scholars debated whether his cruelty had been born from sickness or from an empire that rewarded spectacle more than sanity. Each era found something new to see in him, a tyrant, a prophet, a warning, a reflection of itself. Ancient Rome had long since fallen, its temples crumbled, its gods forgotten, yet Caligula's shadow lingered in the human imagination. He became more than a man who once ruled. He became a question whispered across ages. How far will power go before it begins to devour itself? Even in modern times, that question did not fade. Politicians quoted his story to warn of corruption. Artists used his madness to explore the limits of control. Psychologists dissected his mind as if it were a map to every dark corner of the human spirit. In every retelling, one truth remained constant. He was both victim and executioner of his own divinity. The ruins of his world still stand. Visitors walking through the remains of the Palatine Hill pause before fragments of marble steps, imagining him there. A young ruler dressed in gold, eyes alight with impossible certainty. The sea near Baiae still ripples where his floating palaces once drifted, where he believed the horizon itself bent to his command. History may mock him, but the wind across those stones carries something quieter, a reminder that power, like the sea, can be calm one moment and consuming the next. Over the years, his story seeped into legend. Some said his ghost haunted the Tiber, laughing under the moonlight. Others swore that his voice echoed faintly in the ruins after rain, not with rage, but with a kind of sadness, as though he was still searching for the love that power had stolen from him. Myths blurred with truth until even historians could no longer tell where the man ended and the myth began. And perhaps that was his final victory. For all his cruelty, his extravagance, his madness, Caligula achieved what every ruler secretly craves. He became unforgettable. Not through kindness, not through empire, but through the strange, immortal force of fascination. He burned so brightly that history could not look away, and in doing so he proved a dark and lasting lesson, that in the hands of the wrong dreamer, power is not a crown. It is a mirror, and it always breaks. The centuries that followed turned Caligula from history into mythology. His name, once whispered in terror, became a symbol woven into the very idea of power itself. Every age found its own Caligula, a ruler, a leader, a reflection of arrogance dressed as destiny. His story, retold by poets and chroniclers, outlasted the marble of his palaces and the ashes of his empire. Even now his life stands as both warning and fascination, proof that mankind never stops circling the same fire that once consumed him. For ancient Rome, his reign was a fever dream, 4 years that felt like a lifetime. His cruelty had burned so brightly that even the emperors who came after him could not escape his shadow. They built carefully, ruled cautiously, always aware that the memory of his madness could rise again if the people's fear ever outweighed their faith. Claudius, who replaced him, ruled with trembling caution. Nero, who followed later, would repeat many of his mistakes. It was as if Caligula had infected Rome with a sickness that time alone could not cure. The hunger to be adored, to stand above mortality, to be remembered at any cost. Historians, centuries later, searched for meaning in his chaos. Some said he had been born too young into a dynasty too cruel. Others claimed he was the inevitable product of absolute power, a mirror held up to the very empire that created him. Rome had raised its emperors as gods and then acted shocked when they began to believe it. Caligula was not an exception. He was the consequence. His madness, though monstrous, also revealed the fragility of the world around him. The Senate, which had once prided itself on dignity, became a chorus of frightened actors, The guards who swore loyalty turned into instruments of fear. Even the people who once worshipped his generosity learned to cheer through trembling lips. His empire did not collapse because of his cruelty alone. It endured it, adapted to it, allowed it. In that endurance lay its greatest tragedy. And yet, for all his darkness, there remains in Caligula's story a strange, almost poetic melancholy. The child who ran through Roman camps in tiny boots, the boy soldiers once lifted on their shoulders, became a man surrounded by marble and gold, but utterly alone. He sought love in worship, meaning in chaos, and immortality in destruction. His empire obeyed him, yet not one soul truly loved him. Perhaps that was the real source of his madness, not his power, but the emptiness beneath it. Today, when travellers walk through the ruins of the Palatine Hill, the air still hums with his ghost. The broken columns that once held his palace seem to remember the echo of his voice, half command, half prayer. Standing there, among the dust and quiet, one can almost imagine the world as he saw it, vast, trembling, and impossibly alive. Caligula's story remains a mirror, still reflecting those who gaze into it. In every age, people have searched for the line between passion and tyranny, between genius and madness. He crossed that line long ago, and perhaps in doing so, ensured that none of us would ever stop looking for it again. Time continued its slow march, carrying Rome farther and farther from the age of Caligula. The empire expanded, crumbled, and was reborn in new forms, but the echo of his reign endured like a scar that refused to fade. Each new emperor knew his name, whispered it as a warning, sometimes as a comparison, sometimes as a shadow cast over their own reflection. To rule Rome was to stand beneath the ghost of Caligula, a reminder that power could raise a man to the heavens or drag him into madness. Centuries later, historians would still argue over who he truly was. Was he a monster born of cruelty, or a child broken by loss? Was his insanity a sickness of the mind, or simply the logical conclusion of divine power left unchecked? The answers changed with the centuries, bending to the beliefs of those who asked. In one age he was a lesson in tyranny, in another a tragic figure consumed by loneliness. To modern eyes, he became something more, a case study in how humanity's need to control, to dominate, to be worshipped, can twist even the brightest soul into darkness. The ruins of his world, silent and crumbling, became a testament to that truth. The marble floors that once reflected torchlight and laughter now lie cracked under the weight of centuries. Moss grows where golden thrones once stood. The wind moves through the empty halls like a sigh from the past. Tourists wander with cameras and maps, tracing the outlines of vanished grandeur, not realizing that every step they take is over the bones of forgotten stories. And somewhere in that silence, if one listens long enough, it almost feels as if the stones themselves remember. For Caligula's life was not only a tale of power, it was also a meditation on the human condition. He embodied every contradiction: love and cruelty, brilliance and delusion, faith and arrogance. He showed the world that the pursuit of immortality always ends the same way, with the realization that eternity is not peace, but isolation. No matter how high one rises, the sky remains empty. Artists still found beauty in his tragedy. Painters captured the gleam of his madness. Writers gave him voices softer than history had allowed. They portrayed him not only as a tyrant, but as a man standing on the edge of infinity, daring the universe to look back at him. And through those retellings, his name found new life, not as the symbol of Rome's cruelty, but as an eternal question. What happens when the dream of perfection meets the imperfection of being human? The empire that made him is long gone, but its reflection survives in every age that seeks power without compassion. The lesson remains unchanged. No crown can make a god, and no empire can outlive its own vanity. And perhaps that is why Caligula endures, not because of what he built, but because of what he revealed. He was both warning and reflection, flame and mirror, and even now, across the gulf of centuries, his story whispers the same truth. The greatest empires are not conquered from without, they crumble from within. The centuries that followed transformed Caligula's name into something larger than life, a symbol of the extremes of human ambition. Even as the Roman Empire faded into history, his image lived on in the imagination of every civilization that rose from its ashes. He became both myth and metaphor, invoked whenever a ruler grew too proud, or a nation began to worship its own reflection. His life was retold not as mere biography, but as allegory, the story of how the hunger for adoration can consume the soul that craves it. Medieval scribes copied fragments of his tale by candlelight, sometimes condemning him as a demon in human form, sometimes warning that the same madness still slept in the hearts of men. Renaissance thinkers rediscovered him with fascination, seeing in his cruelty not only evil, but the tragic mark of genius unrestrained. He became a mirror for every era's obsession with power, the reminder that beauty, intelligence, and divine ambition, when left unchecked, turn inward until they destroy the one who wields them. As the world changed, so did the meaning of his story. In the Enlightenment, philosophers cited him as proof that reason must rule emotion, that unchecked desire leads to tyranny. In modern times, psychologists dissected his mind, searching for trauma behind the crown. Was he a sociopath, or simply a child who had grown up in a world where love was replaced by fear? No single answer satisfied. Perhaps that is why his legacy endures, because he refuses to fit neatly into villainy or pity. He remains, like Rome itself, glorious and terrible in equal measure. In the ruins of his palaces, archaeologists uncovered remnants of his impossible dreams, a mosaic of waves inlaid with mother of pearl, a half-collapsed archway that once led to the sea, fragments of a marble inscription reading Divus Gaius, the divine Gaius. Even broken, these relics held an eerie beauty, as if time itself could not quite bring itself to erase him. The more the centuries passed, the clearer it became that he had achieved the immortality he desired, not through temples or armies, but through the fascination he still inspired. Every empire that came after Rome studied his downfall, hoping to learn how not to repeat it. Yet somehow, history found new Caligulas again and again. Men and women who believed themselves chosen, who mistook fear for loyalty, who built monuments to themselves and called it destiny. It was as if his spirit drifted through time, reminding the world of its most dangerous temptation, to believe that one life can stand above all others. And still, there was something human in that madness. The boy who once ran laughing through the camps of his father's legions, adored by soldiers, never truly vanished. Somewhere beneath the cruelty, beneath the gold and the blood, lingered that same child reaching for love he would never find. That, perhaps, is what makes his story so haunting. It is not simply the tale of a tyrant, but of a man who could not bear the limits of being mortal. Even now, when people stand among the ruins of ancient Rome and watch the sunset burn across the sky, they speak his name softly, as if afraid it might still be listening. Caligula, the emperor who wanted to be eternal and in some strange way succeeded. And so, the story of Caligula comes to rest where it began, not in the blood and marble of ancient Rome, but in the quiet contemplation of what it means to be human. Time has softened the details of his life, erasing the sharpness of his cruelty and the glitter of his excess, leaving behind something deeper, a reflection. Across 2,000 years he remains both a question and a warning, a man whose rise and fall reveal how fragile the line truly is between genius and madness, between worship and destruction. His life was short, but its echo has stretched far beyond his years, becoming a parable carved into the bones of civilization itself. History records him as one of the most infamous rulers the world has ever known, yet the truth feels more complicated than the legend. Caligula was not born a monster. He was born into a world that adored power more than kindness, spectacle more than truth. A child of empire, raised in fear and surrounded by betrayal, he learned early that survival meant control, and control meant worship. When Rome finally gave him the throne, it gave him everything he had been taught to desire, and everything that would destroy him. His reign, though drenched in madness, was not only the story of a single man's descent, but of a civilization staring into its own reflection. The senators who bowed before him, the soldiers who carried out his whims, the citizens who cheered and trembled, all played their part in creating the god they later condemned. His cruelty was born from their silence as much as his will. In Caligula, Rome found not a stranger but itself, magnified until the illusion could no longer be ignored. Perhaps that is why his legacy endures while so many others fade. He was the embodiment of humanity's oldest contradiction, the longing to be more than human, and the tragedy that follows when that longing succeeds. Even now, his name lives on in books, in films, in whispered comparisons whenever power begins to lose its balance. He stands as a symbol of what happens when fear replaces reason, when worship becomes obedience, and when a man forgets that to rule is not to own, but to serve. Yet behind all the noise of history there lingers a quieter image, that of a lonely figure walking through his palace at night, his reflection flickering in the polished marble, his voice a murmur to unseen gods. In those moments, one can almost imagine him not as a tyrant, but as a lost soul searching for something infinite in a world made of dust. Perhaps his tragedy was not that he thought himself a god, but that he could never bear being merely a man. And so his story endures, not as a chronicle of power, but as a timeless echo of the human heart's most dangerous dream. For in every age there will always be another Caligula waiting, not on a throne, but within us, the part that hungers to be adored, that fears insignificance, that would rather be feared than forgotten. His empire is long gone, but his lesson remains eternal. When we mistake worship for love, even the brightest light can burn the world to ash.